Recently had a chance to sit down with a neuroscientist friend of mine where we talked about psilocybin, its impact, its uses in like therapy and other crazy things. So here's the conversation. Hope you enjoy. We're going to talk about psilocybin, the mystery behind shrooms, and everything that entails. Here with Dr. Wegener. She's a neuroscientist from Vandy, right?
Yeah, I do neuroscience at Vanderbilt.
So neuroscientist at Vandy, and she's going to educate us. And we're doing an explain like I'm five kind of approach here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So high level, started off, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background.
So I've been doing neuroscience since college, and I got my PhD at University of Pittsburgh. I mainly studied dopamine, actually, and the way that dopamine works in adults and adolescents when they're learning new things.
Okay. Perfect. So whenever we talk about like the dopamine hit from like social media, doom scrolling, stuff like that, is kind of your domain?
That is my domain.
Okay.
I get into many conversations with people about whether or not Andrew Huberman is leading them down the right road. So
I have so many questions about that, but we'll save that for a separate one.
Okay. I'm happy to talk about it anytime.
No, absolutely. Psilocybin, just kind of dive right into it. What is that exactly?
So psilocybin is the psychoactive ingredient that's found in most hallucinogenic mushrooms.
Okay.
Psilocybin is what you take into your body. It's what you're ingesting, but it's actually not what's acting in your brain.
Okay.
So psilocybin is a little bit unique in that it needs to be processed by your liver before it can actually act anywhere. That's why you always have to eat it or drink it in tea.
Okay.
You can't inject mushrooms, right? You have to eat it.
Interesting. Okay. So it's like activated by the breaking down in your liver and your...
Yes, it has to be broken down from psilocybin into psilocin.
Okay, so psilocybin is like the raw version, if you will, where what was it?
Psilocin?
Psilocin is like the version your body's actually digesting and processing.
Well, psilocybin is what you're digesting and processing. Psilocin is what you get at the end that can actually go to your brain and interact with things in your brain to cause the effects that you experience.
Okay. The more you know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So you get it from mushrooms. Obviously, there's edible mushrooms like shiitake, lion's mane, portobello. There's deadly ones.
Absolutely.
I'm drawing absolute blanks on any deadly mushrooms. Then we have we'll call them recreational ones here. What separates the three high level?
As far as I know, what's going to separate the three is whether or not they produce particular molecules or toxins.
Okay.
So that's more of a botanist than a neuroscientist.
Sure.
But shiitake or lion's mane doesn't have any sort of psychoactive substance in it, and it shouldn't have anything in it that upsets your stomach in and of it, right? Anything that's poisonous is going to contain something that your body is going to reject and it's going to be sick. So it's going to have some sort of toxin in it, some sort of something you find poisonous. Usually when animals or fungi develop that, it's to protect things from eating them.
Right. It's kind of like how peppers developed a spicy taste, so animals will stop eating them.
Yes.
But then we as humans were like, hey, we like that.
Which is interesting because usually it's good for animals to eat those sort of things and help spread the seeds. But for fungi, I think since they have spores, they don't necessarily work as well when they pass through the digestive system. So
makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. But so any psychoactive mushroom will create certain substances. So like, have you ever heard of ayahuasca?
Yes.
So ayahuasca is totally separate, totally different drug from psilocybin versus something like DMT. All of which are psychoactive. They're all hallucinogens, and they all come from plants, but totally different plants.
Okay, awesome. So as we talk about psilocybin, it hits your liver, it processes it, then it hits your body. What are potential things you might experience?
So for psilocybin, well, for most hallucinogens, there's a web of things that we experience usually. A sense of oneness with the world, sometimes people will experience the divine. There's often a sense of you feel like experiencing a new way to look at life. So sort of revelations.
Okay.
There's usually some sort of sensory distortion. So we call it hallucinogenic, but really a hallucinogen is like me seeing something that you think is not there. Like that's a purple elephant. It's in the room. You'd be like, no, there is not.
Okay.
What the sort of things you get with psilocybin is not purple elephants, but more like the walls are melting, where it's like we can both agree that there are walls, but I think that the paint on them is melting, and you're like, no, they are not. So it's actually a distortion in sensory perception rather than your brain just creating something that's not there.
Okay, so distorting the reality you're in as opposed to creating a new one.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so with LSD or something like that, you can get the hallucinations that's not as common with psilocybin.
Okay, so LSD similar in certain ways, but very different in that. Okay.
Yeah. One of the things that makes another effect that you can have in psilocybin that's really used more therapeutically than recreationally is a breakdown between cause and effect. So, for example, if you're experiencing a lot of guilt around something, and you're saying, "Oh, well, I did this, so I deserve for bad things to happen to me," that's a cause and effect link that you've made in your brain.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're having difficulty breaking that down in therapy, psilocybin assisted therapy can actually make it much more effective. So it's been proven to be fairly effective in some treatment-resistant disorders such as PTSD or addiction.
Okay. Before we turn the camera on, you were talking about how it's making a lot of growth in therapy channels.
Yes.
Let's expand on that a little bit. I know you touched on it can help overcome a few barriers, but I guess how did that get started?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it really got started with Timothy O'Leary and all of those people. There were a series of academics in the 1970s who were basically like, why are we not using all of these drugs? They're miracle workers.
Mm-hmm.
And actually the guy who started LSD, he discovered it accidentally when he was working with bread mold. He accidentally consumed it and had a huge trip, and then purposely consumed it and had another huge trip, and then tried to convince everybody else in his department to purposely consume it. But his actual first use for LSD was in therapy. So now other drugs that work similarly to LSD, including psilocybin, have been put forth as potential therapeutics since the 1970s.
Okay.
But then when the DEA was established and drugs started being scheduled and controlled by the government, it made it significantly harder for researchers to ever study it. So there was a long period of time where it was basically impossible. That's where it's sort of just shifted in the last 20 years or so. Yeah. It's been significantly easier to get your hands on Schedule I drugs, such as cannabis, LSD, psilocybin.
No, it's great to see the improvements. And for people that don't know, we talked about the drug schedule, and please correct me if I'm wrong. It's typically like a Schedule 1, 2, 3, 1 being in the eyes of the DEA, the most egregious, most damaging, minimal use outside of its drug-related purpose. Mm-hmm. Whereas like a Category 3 would be seen as much more recreational. Yeah. Actually has purposes, like cancer treatment for cannabis is a big one. I see a lot of Schedule 2 is just somewhere in between, right?
So it's interesting. The way that we actually use drugs often has nothing to do with the way they're scheduled. For example, cannabis, marijuana, it's a Schedule I drug. Schedule I is what we think of as high potential for abuse, meaning if you use it, you're going to get addicted, and no medical use. So you put cannabis in that list. Heroin is also in that list.
Two very different things.
LSD also in that list. However, it is actually very rare for anybody to use LSD and then meet the criteria for a substance use disorder with purely LSD. It does have medical use, which we are now figuring out. Psilocybin, I believe, is Schedule 2, but might be Schedule 1. An example of something that's Schedule 3 is PCP. So it was created as an anesthetic, but it's still a Schedule 3 drug, meaning that it has some potential for abuse and some medical use. So scheduling, the way that drugs are scheduled by the federal government is political. It's not always entirely based on medical or scientific data.
And science, empirical data.
Yeah.
More so the opinions of our elected officials.
Yes, as well as it's often easy to get elected by being hard on drugs, right? So nobody wants to be seen as being light or permissive. So there is absolutely that piece. I think I saw a news story the other day that they're going to try and change the scheduling for cannabis specifically to move it out of Schedule 1. Schedule 1 drugs are particularly difficult for scientists to study. So something like cocaine, I believe, Schedule 2, and can actually be studied quite easily.
Interesting. Okay. There's like a thought trying to figure out how to articulate, at that point it's just political whims as opposed to scientific advancement.
It can be. They could make the argument that cannabis was put in Schedule 1 drug when this law was established because we didn't know it had any medical use.
Okay.
But honestly, people have been using cannabis or hemp in medicine for a long time, right? Thomas Jefferson used to smoke hemp. You've heard that before.
Yeah.
So we've known that, but it was associated with dangerous patterns of behavior that the government was also linking with immigrants and other disruptive groups that they had identified. So they're definitely, I think they would say, absolutely, we do have evidence, but it's not the kind of evidence that we think of as scientists. We're trying to determine, here's a brand new drug that we've created. does it have addictive potential? Does it have medical use? There's a whole range of tests that we do. And if you run those tests on something like cannabis, you wouldn't expect it to be in a Schedule 1. You'd probably expect it to be something like Schedule 3, where there is potential for abuse and it has medical use. So it should be controlled in some way, but not super difficult to get your hands on if you want to use it for medical uses.
Okay. No, great explanation. Appreciate that. Yeah, I definitely had that wrong. So perfect. So yeah, back to, psilocybin. Obviously it's mushrooms. So mushrooms, there's, I believe, thousands of types of variations, different types. For the people that, find the psilocybin-based mushrooms, is a lot of that trial and error? Did they grow them?
Honestly, I think some people do grow them. Absolutely. I have a friend who bought a farm and he retired at 35 doing his farm in West Virginia. And one of the first things he planted was a mushroom lawn full of psilocybin mushrooms. So absolutely, you can grow them yourself. I think they were identified. I think they've mostly been used in indigenous, spiritual rites. And so they've been identified by indigenous people.
Okay.
Now that mushrooms are a much wider, larger cultural phenomenon, both, I've seen a documentary about mushrooms. I don't know about you. It's good. But I think you could now go on Reddit or somewhere online and be able to identify them and the kind of environments that they like. But mushrooms are not the most difficult thing to grow, and they are not necessarily, but you do need outdoor space, unlike something like cannabis where, potentially you could grow it in a closet.
Because mushrooms are pretty sturdy for the most part, right?
I'm actually not sure about the actual strains that create psilocybin, but I think so.
Yeah.
If you take care of them properly, because they like dark, wet places, and so if you, that's usually pretty easy to create if you have any sort of woods or anything like that on your property.
Perfect. So psilocybin, people found it, we like it, we keep using it. Obviously there's different levels you can take, from a microdose up to. Actually, one of the questions I had is there such thing as a lethal dose of psilocybin?
Lethal dose of psilocybin, I want to say...
Or just be a really bad trip?
I want to say yes, but honestly, I'm not sure off the top of my head. I do know, for cannabis, and I always say to my students, this is not a dare. This is not something I'm saying so you can prove me wrong.
Imploring clarification.
There's never been a documented overdose of cannabis or LSD, like a overdose death of cannabis or LSD ever.
Okay.
Right? So the limit does not exist as far as we can tell. Usually you can die while ingesting those things, often if they're combined with other things or you do something dangerous while on them.
Right.
Psilocybin, off the top of my head, I'm unsure. But since knowing its mechanism is quite similar to LSD, I think it would be difficult. The only thing that gives me pause is that I know it also works on a glutamate receptor that is really important. So if that is the one thing I'm unsure of. But usually the most likelihood, if you took too much, for example, you take a stem and you think, I don't feel it, I'm going to take another. Classic mistake. Yeah. It is more likely that you would have a really unpleasant experience more than you would have a lethal overdose. As well as a lot of people find them hard to ingest. So it can be most people I think would throw up before they would end up poisoned. But if it is a danger, it is not a common one. I think you would need to take a lot more than the common dose.
So that makes pretty much concentrated in some way.
Yes, which I'm not sure is particularly common. Even when we use it therapeutically, people are still eating they're eating actual mushrooms or they're drinking tea. They're not drinking like an extract in that way.
So it's pretty much you get the raw form in some way.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Awesome. Well, I've got a couple questions from some friends.
Sure.
Instagram. I'd like to hit you through these. The first question is, can shrooms be harmful if taken regularly?
Can shrooms be harmful if taken regularly? So like any drug, when you take it, you're not sure what effect you will get. And people who have a vulnerability to psychiatric disorder, for example, if you have a family history of schizophrenia, taking something like shrooms can bring on a psychotic break. So there's no drug that is safe for absolutely everybody. However, I don't know of any studies that show that regular use of psilocybin is inherently dangerous. It will, however, change the way your brain works. That's not bad necessarily or dangerous, but then your brain will work differently than it did before. That might be why you're doing it regularly. It might be part of what you're looking for, but I don't know of any inherent dangers in it.
You saying that reminded me of my question I forgot. With psilocybin, is it one of those drugs where your mental state before you take it impacts your experience on it?
Yes. So when we talk about hallucinogens, you always need to consider your set and your setting. By set, we mean your mindset, what you're doing into it. So I've personally never done any hallucinogens because I'm a little bit of an anxious person, and I'm really worried that I'd have a bad trip, and that makes it significantly more likely that I would, right?
Because you'd be thinking
about it, and I'd be worried. And what LSD and psilocybin and other hallucinogens can do is magnify the emotions that you're feeling. They're not great drugs if you're looking to hide how you're feeling. Often people use drugs to escape how they feel. That's common use of something like alcohol, which can dull your feelings. But LSD and psilocybin will not do that. It can be, if you're trying to avoid emotions, it can actually end up to be a pretty intense experience.
Because it'll draw them out.
It will draw them out and sort of...
At an exaggerated scale almost.
Yeah.
Okay.
It can.
Interesting.
So the setting part of mindset and setting is about where you take them. So if you take them at a rave or in a forest, you're going to have very different experiences.
Because raves, you got loud music, lots of people.
A lot of
bright
heat.
colors.
Bright colors, yeah.
People.
So there's just a lot of things happening, and it could be very overwhelming. Versus if like you're in a forest and you're sort of being one with nature, you're more likely to have those sort of introspective experiences, or like come to have revelations about nature or your relationship with nature or your place in the world, versus just the experiential sensory information that you might get if you're doing it something like sensory intense situation like a rave.
Interesting. Awesome. Yeah, that was the question I completely forgot. So the next question I had, was about breastfeeding. For a mom that is breastfeeding, does this get into the milk or not?
This is what we refer to as pharmacokinetics, right? I believe, yes. Psilocybin has a half-life of several hours.
Okay.
So I think you'd be okay if, for example, you pumped and then waited at least a day or two before you breastfed again. But it absolutely can pass from your digestive system into your breast milk.
Okay, so if mother is breastfeeding, does it, let it pass through their system entirely before they start?
Yes, because babies don't metabolize things in the same ways that we do, right? That's why you're not supposed to drink caffeine with your breastfeeding, because we can metabolize caffeine and babies can't. Okay. So it just builds up in their system until you get rid of it. So psilocybin, if you want to avoid that, the best thing to do would be to pump, like have pumps beforehand or supplement formula.
Then the next question, which I think we kind of indirectly answered, is how long do they show up on a drug test?
Depends on what kind of drug test you're doing. So if you're doing like hair versus urine, that would be different. And in hair, it's going to depend on how long your hair is, but they will show, I think will show up in hair and could be months. But urine, I'm not exactly sure off the top of my head, but I would expect a few days. I don't think it stays in the same way. Cannabis is one that stays there for a long time, but it's because it's really lipophilic. So it stays in your fat deposits for a long time. But psilocybin doesn't have that same sort of chemical interaction.
And you kind of at a comparison point to that, I've heard a drug like cocaine goes in and out of your system very quickly. Is that
yes, absolutely. Okay. It gets broken down by your liver really quickly, which is also why people usually are doing multiple lines of cocaine in a night. And psilocybin, you take it and like whether you like it or not, you're in it for the next several hours. So I believe in a day or two, it would be gone. I remember when I was growing up, I heard stories about like, if you take LSD, it'll be in your spinal fluid forever and things like that. None of that's true. And not true for psilocybin either.
Okay, interesting. This is a very specific question. What's an effective or an efficient microdosing regimen for mental clarity?
Interesting. So, I mean, number one, if you were interested in that, it's going to be trial and error for anybody, because it's going to have to do with when you take it during the day, what you're taking it with. You are eating mushrooms, so what's in your stomach is going to impact how it's absorbed. So if you take them after eating food, you're going to have slower absorption, a slower peak. So it's going to take you longer to feel the main effects, and you might need a higher dose to feel the same effects. So if you're but you have to know whether or not it provides you mental clarity. Many people report that it does.
Your mileage may vary.
Your mileage may vary, and of course, it's not all mushrooms are the same, you're not necessarily going to get the same amount of psilocybin out of every stem.
That's true. It's not like mass-produced food where it's like, hey, this is 10 milligrams of whatever every single serving. It's like,
and it's not like
growing conditions, etc., is all going to impact that.
Absolutely. And it's not like LSD, which is an artificial chemical that is synthesized and then measured onto whatever strip you're like, your paper or sugar cube or whatever. So psilocybin, like cannabis, it's going to be significantly harder to get an exact dosage if you're just consuming the plant.
Makes sense. And this is you saying that made me think of another question. I know a lot of prescription drugs, I've seen them where they say don't take with like grapefruit or other citrus fruits. Is psilocybin impacted by grapefruits or similar like that?
Not that I know of, but it might be, because what grapefruit does is it changes the way it can act in two ways. Usually the way it works is that it changes the way it's absorbed from your stomach into your bloodstream. So it won't be particularly well absorbed because the grapefruit will break it down before. I'm not sure if that applies to psilocybin. I don't believe so.
Okay.
For me, the two main drugs that I've come across that have a grapefruit interaction are antibiotics and birth control pills. And I don't think psilocybin shares a lot of pharmacokinetic properties with either.
Interesting. Okay. Then the last question, I think this one very much depends on where somebody resides, but how would one safely acquire psilocybin mushrooms?
I'm not sure. The only time I've ever acquired them is from friends who are like, I'm growing mushrooms, you want some? But that's also like, it is a concern always. Like, even with these drugs that don't necessarily have a huge inherent risk in them, like you need to know if what you're getting is actually what you think it is. So it's not something that I've ever tried to procure. I would absolutely say no to anything you got off the internet, just because it could be any mushroom. And there's usually people who are passionate about mushrooms and like take it really seriously. So I would say it's more, I mean, like, you're always welcome to ask somebody at a festival, I guess, but buyer beware.
Yeah.
Because why they might be willing to share, you don't know what else might be in them.
That's true. I guess unless you know exactly what you're looking for, and it's roll the dice, and
yes,
which may not be good because
and unlike something like MDMA where you can get a test kit and check for its purity, that's pretty difficult to do with psilocybin. So, like, you can always get a fentanyl test strip and test to see if there's any fentanyl included in the mushrooms, but that's really about all you can do. So I think it'd be pretty easy to end up buying mushrooms that actually aren't psychoactive at all.
Or worse,
or something.
Poison you or kill you.
That would be terrible, but it's usually not particularly worth it to somebody who's selling those things. That it's easier to
draws attention.
Draws attention, creates problems. Ground up or like air dried or something, so they just look right.
Right. It's all about branding.
Yeah.
But there's one thing, I don't know if you've seen it. Joe Rogan, obviously his podcast. I can't remember the exact name the interview had on it, but they were talking about mushrooms just in general. And Joe Rogan asked him about, I don't remember exactly which mushroom, but it's one we eat. It's a very safe one. But the guy just flat out would not talk about it for fear of his life.
Huh.
And then Joe thought he was kind of joking at first, and the guy was like dead serious. And he's like, okay, moving on.
Huh.
If you can find the snippet and then the episode, I highly recommend it.
Okay. I mean, the thing is that's interesting is that like people are really passionate about mushrooms. Significantly more so than any other source of drug. Like I know people who have taken LSD and felt that it changed their lives. I dated a guy at one point in my life who got a tattoo every time he did LSD because he felt like it was just so impactful of what he learned. But I haven't heard anybody but there's something about mushrooms and the study of mycelium in general that people get so enthused about and have the strongest feeling. And I'm sure that that person, whoever they were, had already experienced the impact of sharing their opinion about that mushroom and was unwilling to do it somewhere where you had such a large audience.
Yeah. That's true. Like kind of like we were talking about of, you have the Reddits and, Joe Rogan obviously has an audience and other people, like anything they put out there. And, it's decentralization of information. Like anybody can access it for better or worse.
Yeah.
And, as we see, keyboard warriors are plenty these days.
Yeah.
Whether they're right or wrong, that's all subject, but.
Yep. So, I mean, if you're going to take a strong stance on something that anybody feels really passionate about, you can experience some bad outcomes.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what it is. Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of all I have about, doing a deeper dive into like every single thing about it, which can all be fun in the future stuff,
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about any drug. I mean, like my expertise is how it works in the brain, what it does in the brain. But it's not a thing that's super accessible to a massively wide audience. And all the time, but I'm always happy to explain if people have questions.
Yeah. Psilocybin, obviously, animal testing is still very much a thing for a lot of things. Does it get tested on rats, or is it comparable? It does?
Yep, absolutely. So all of the preclinical studies that are done before any of the clinical trials that are happening with psilocybin were all done in rats and mice.
Okay.
Yep.
And then have you seen the study of I can't remember the exact type of spider, but it's one that makes, like a very big webs.
Yeah.
One they had on different drugs.
Yeah.
Okay.
Those are so cool. Yeah, it's basically it's a measure of how it impacts both your sensory function, your motor function, and then also sort of things like planning or instincts.
Yeah.
But I don't remember what the one did they do one for psilocybin?
I'd have to go back and double check because I remember they're like, hey, this is like the main unaltered web. They're like, this is the web on like marijuana. It was a little sloppier.
Yeah.
They're like, this is the web on cocaine. There's like 7 strings. And clearly made no sense for a spider web. And I'll have to go back and check, see if they did one with psilocybin.
LSD is probably easier because you can put a drop of LSD on anything and have them eat it because it's so potent and works in really, really tiny doses, unlike psilocybin.
Sure. So they probably haven't had a chance to successfully do that.
I mean, I'm sure you could extract psilocybin from mushrooms, just most people don't bother doing it. I think it's probably expensive or timely, and it's just easier to just eat the mushroom.
We just haven't figured out the technology yet.
Yeah, there's now big money in extracting THC from cannabis, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think that will necessarily be the case for psilocybin.
Right. It's like a capsaicin from peppers, just to get the good stuff.
Yes, exactly. But usually people aren't looking at donating pepper for pure capsaicin. They're also looking for like the crunch and any other sort of flavor.
The experience of it all. Well, Meredith, again, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've touched on so many things. I was like, there's like 50 ideas I have for future videos if you're open to it.
Absolutely. I'm happy to talk anytime.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Happy to be here, Daryl.
And I don't know if you want to shout out your socials or if you're just like, I'm good just to hang out.
I'm good.
Awesome. Again, thank you so much.
Sure. Happy to. So this is just like a thing that you're doing for your show?
Yeah.
Nice.
Cut it up into social clips and edit it out and all that.
Who else? Any other interviews you've done so far for me?